My name is Kate Kaplan, and I am the Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee. So I will proudly hand it over to Ryan.
Thank you. Well, I'm trusting, Kate, that you can hear me, and I'll use you as the canary in the coal mine that everybody else can. Very good. I'm going to make an apology up front that I do actually literally seem to be a floating head. The camera in this computer is at the bottom. That's why you see the keyboard. This is as good as it's going to get. Anyway, well, Kate, if you can maybe share the screen and bring up the slides, because I think you have control. So there we go. All right, so this is going to be roughly the scope of our talk for the next, what is it, Kate, hour, give or take?
Hour, yes.
Okay. And so our office is, compared to the rest of the country, fairly bizarrely situated in that we, and by our office I mean the Louisiana Department of Justice, in that we have fairly substantial jurisdiction over protection of cultural heritage in the state of Louisiana. And some of that is by way of enforcement authority. A lot of it is by way of legal representation of the agencies with enforcement authority. As Kate mentioned, our representation of the State Cemetery Board and the State Archaeologist is to be their legal representative for the purposes of enforcement of the state's Unmarked Burials Act, the Antiquities Act, and which is a separate series of laws, not the Federal Antiquities Act, and the cemetery title. My particular interest is in dealing with the applications of the law and science to the protection and preservation of cemeteries and human remains. That's what my background is in as an anthropologist, and continue to do research in that area. So, Kate, if I could trouble you to advance a slide.
Oh, that was the wrong button.
Okay. Couple of disclaimers. There are some images in here that show human remains. Those images are not intended to be here in a disrespectful manner. They're intended to be here to illustrate certain points regarding the enforcement of protections related to those remains. And I think there was one disclaimer before this one that was also that the contents of this presentation are not necessarily the opinions of Louisiana Attorney General or the Department of Justice. But with that said, we have always experienced through 3 different attorneys general since I've been here the full support of the department in the protection of these types of resources. All right, next slide. All right, and we can go to the next slide too. So you guys should be relatively familiar with NAGPRA, so I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on it, but it is, of course, the keystone law that a lot of the jurisdiction that has now appeared in the states has found its inspiration from or derived from. NAGPRA, for those of y'all who don't know, is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It is federal law. It was enacted in 1990. From our perspective as those who work at the state level, NAGPRA is fairly limited in that it only applies to federal and tribal property or to federal projects. So it does not really give us as the states an awful lot of leeway to deal with damages to human remains sites, curation of human remains, what have you, once it leaves that federal purview. And unfortunately, there's an awful lot that does go on outside of that federal and tribal purview, at least in Louisiana. And I think that some of the concepts that we discuss, or that I'm going to talk to you all about, are probably more applicable to the eastern states, because of course, as you get further west, you got more federal lands, tribal lands. And so NAGPRA, I think, does become a more substantial enforcement tool out in that direction. But for those of us who are on the east side of the Mississippi River, we need additional help. Next slide, please. All right, one of these interesting things, and I just love this, I think it was a completely unintended consequence, but I'm trying to start with the federal law and kind of work my way down to the local law, is this most recent act, the Sunken Military Craft Act. I forget the year, but it's been within the last decade, I believe, that Congress enacted this. And it was intended to protect just what it says, military vessels. But what I think was an unintended consequence, and from my perspective, a very good unintended consequence, is that it bolsters the federal protections for cemetery sites under certain circumstances. The interesting thing that the Sunken Military Craft Act does is it does talk about sunken military vessels, but it doesn't talk about the fact that they have to be currently underwater. It could be that, and this happens, you'll see it a lot on the interior rivers in the United States. For those of y'all who are familiar with steamboat travel in the central United States, a lot of sunken vessels that ran aground and were left partially salvaged or unsalvaged in the interior rivers eventually became silted over and are often laying underneath private property in the central United States. Well, under this law, again, I think unintentionally, if the vessel was some kind of military vessel, a cargo ship, a troop transport, what have you, and it had individuals that died on the ship, then it provides, this law provides fairly substantial and significant protections for those archaeological sites that otherwise would accede to private property laws in the United States. And this is, like I said, a recent law. And so you can think to the, what was it? I can't think of the name of the riverboat in Kansas City that's on display there. You know, it's a beautifully done museum, not really an archaeological excavation, at least in the beginning stages. Now that one did not have, to my knowledge, any human remains on it, but if we do end up finding troop transports that go down, especially as a result of movements during the Civil War, this law is going to apply, and if there are human remains that are associated with it, it's also going to apply. So this is a fairly significant federal law. It's relatively recent, and it has not been tested for its application to cemetery sites, but I just wanted y'all to be aware of it. Next slide, please. All right, so that brings us down to a state level focus. And of course, I'm here in Louisiana, so you guys are going to get our version of NAGPRA. But if most of you look to your local state statutes, you will find an equivalent. That doesn't exist in all states. Shockingly, this is the 30th anniversary of NAGPRA this year. And we still do have a handful of states that do not have a state analog to NAGPRA. Louisiana was one of the early states to adopt NAGPRA, and I will have to admit that there were several states that had their own versions of a NAGPRA-like law that predated NAGPRA. South Dakota and Missouri come to mind, Florida too, I believe. But in 1991, Louisiana legislature enacted the Louisiana Unmarked Human Burial Sites Preservation Act, and it was largely a carbon copy of the concepts, the principles that were embodied in NAGPRA. So just 1 year following the congressional action, it went into effect in 1992. And it applies, importantly, to all of the gaps that are left by NAGPRA. It applies to state property, to local property, and even to private property. And the question of its application to private property has not come up here in Louisiana, but again, other state analogs, one in Rhode Island and one in, I believe it's Minnesota, have been subject to constitutional challenges for whether or not the government can control and regulate the protection of burial places on private property. And in both cases, those statutes, similar to Louisiana's, were found to be constitutional and did not infringe on private property rights. They were not takings. Unfortunately, there was a case out of Pennsylvania. Of course, the name's escaping me now. It'll come back to me. That did make it to the U.S. Supreme Court within the last 2 years on this same question, but the court decided to decide it on other takings grounds not related to the archaeological site protections and their application to private property. Anyway, the other thing that the Louisiana legislature has done is in 2010, after a general thought that there were some gaps in the Unmarked Human Burial Sites Preservation Act, the legislature enacted the Louisiana Historic Cemetery Preservation Act. And that is really just a gap filler and that's a redundant thing in my slide there, so sorry, it's just one law. It's really a gap filler for the Unmarked Burials Act, but it gives fairly substantial protection similar to NAGPRA, and it vests in the Louisiana State Archaeologist the authority to permit excavations of human remains, unmarked and historic cemeteries on all property in the state. We've even exercised that authority on federal property in the state. And that authorization comes with certain standards. We default to the Department of Interior standards for conducting archaeological excavations, but it means that we're not getting random folks going in and just digging up bodies, as was the case historically, if you wanted to impact or move a cemetery. It does carry criminal and civil fines and penalties for doing something that exceeds a permit or without a permit. And so it's a fairly important law in Louisiana. We've used it in a lot of instances. Next slide, please. This is my favorite part of the law. It's really that first bullet point. It says it is unlawful to disturb, buy, sell, barter, exchange, give, receive, possess, display, discard, or destroy human skeletal remains. And that's where my fun part of enforcement comes in, because at the Attorney General's office, when we get reports of human remains being sold, traded, etc., then we get to go and bust folks and try to do the right thing by the remains. As a matter of fact, we're in the process right now of doing NAGPRA consultations with, I can't even remember the number of potentially affiliated tribes for the Native American human remains that we have recovered through illicit sales and other such things in Louisiana. The other remains that we acquire are usually former teaching specimens that have made it into the private stream of commerce. And we, in a lot of cases, if we can definitively say that we can't link this to a descendant community, that it is not Native American, then we do try to make an effort to get those things back to teaching institutions, so that rather than being curios that are holding candles on somebody's fireplace mantle, they're actually being used for medical and in some cases anthropological teaching purposes. Go to the next slide, if you will. All right, so in the state of Louisiana, as I mentioned, we also have Louisiana Cemetery Board, and they seem to be the most visible of our cemetery regulatory entities, so people go straight to them when they see a problem. We do represent them, but their authority is really dealing with operating cemeteries, those that are still doing burials. And so it's not necessarily what you would think of as a preservation entity. However, through the Attorney General's office, the Cemetery Board does have the ability to enforce certain restrictions that can be qualified or classified as historic preservation or resource preservation provisions. And I would encourage y'all in your respective states to take a look at your own equivalent to these cemetery boards. And they are shoved in all kinds of different law in every different state. But a lot of them have authority to do stuff that we would think of as cultural resources protection that may not occur to even their own administrators. Next slide, please, Kate. All right, going to some of the problems they face, abandoned cemeteries. The question is, what do we do with those? And we have actually had to enact a specific law in Louisiana to deal with abandoned cemeteries that folks are still burying in, because these things can be your historic type cemetery, but they don't meet the definition for being cemeteries under the jurisdiction of the state archaeologist for control. And a lot of times what we get are folks that are just quite literally getting out a spade and going out there to bury people without any authorizations or permits. This stuff is often on private property, and it has historical components to it. So there are both resource protection concerns that we have out there, and there are the concerns about desecration of graves in cemeteries that have no visible, obvious manager. So we've had to create a new law. And if you go to the next slide, Kate, I think it'll show some of what I'm talking about. Yeah. So this is an example of an abandoned cemetery in Pineville, Louisiana, which is in the central part of the state. And you can see in the top two images the kind of overgrown, unkempt nature of these cemeteries. Those are above ground vaults, which is a common practice of burial in the Southeast, especially. But then you can see in the third image down at the bottom, there's a fairly well-tended area, and that's just individual families that are working their own spots. And the problem comes in with record keeping and with the preservation of these unkempt spots. How do we keep those from being impacted by future graves? How do we keep them from being desecrated? And whose responsibility is it? And when the title owners, as you can see from this slide, we were able to identify the transaction that created the cemetery, but then the trail ran cold in 1899, and now people are just burying wherever they want out there. And that becomes a regulatory problem, and it's something that I think we're fairly unique in Louisiana for having a law that deals with this. We have a mechanism to implement an authorized operator of such cemetery sites that will keep the historic preservation of the sites, as well as their functioning in nature as a community site, something that the community goes to for grieving and mourning purposes, but then also make sure that it is run properly pursuant to law. So that's just one of the challenges that we deal with here. Next slide. All right, so going back again, so that's one of the roles of the Cemetery Board, and though I said they're really not a historic preservation entity, they're not, but they do have the authority to issue permits for the operation of abandoned cemeteries. So within the scope of the Cemetery Board's jurisdiction, again, a regulatory entity deals largely with trust funds and things like that associated with the perpetual care of cemeteries. There are some laws, and there are similar laws that exist in other states, and I'd encourage you to keep an eye open for those. And what you're seeing here in these images is an example of one of the problems that we have. This was a Catholic church cemetery in New Iberia, Louisiana, and we got a call in from some descendants that said, oh my God, they are knocking down our tombs. And what they were talking about is exactly what you're seeing in the images here. We had these real nice classic Acadian 19th century above ground vaults. A lot of them were made out of brick. They are in a state of disrepair. And the church kind of unilaterally took it upon themselves to say these things are unsightly, so we're going to knock them down, instead of doing some kind of, admittedly expensive, but doing some kind of historically appropriate reconstruction or shoring up of the site. And what you see in the image on the right is what the site looked like after the church had gotten done with their restoration. Ultimately, they would remove those bricks and try to pave over with just a flat, concrete paving. But they were content that they were following the law when they put up, as you can see in the bottom corner, those little paper notices that say, hey, we're going to knock over your tombs. The reason somebody's hand is there is because they immediately curled up in the Louisiana humidity, and nobody could see it, and they didn't have any notice that their tombs were about to be knocked over unlawfully. Let's go to the next slide. I think it hashes out some of these laws. Yeah. Okay. So the laws that we brought to bear in that situation were within the jurisdiction, because this didn't fall under the state archaeologist's authority. It was an active operating cemetery that happened to have historic resources in it. But we found these little gems hidden away in the authority of the State Cemetery Board. And there they are quoted there, which says that you can repair and renovate, but you can't demolish. You can not demolish. You can repair, renovate, and or maintain. And so we've interpreted that, and there was an Attorney General opinion from this office issued in about 2007 on this point that said the law does not sanction the demolition of derelict tombs. All that the cemetery authority, who's usually the landowner, has the authority to do is make repairs, and if and when the family comes to reuse that space for a later interment, they can tax the costs against them. Does it, help the continued maintenance of that resource? No. It doesn't mandate that the landowner do historically accurate or appropriate repairs and renovations, but it also prohibits them from completely flattening it. Next slide. Desecration is another problem that I think all of us see. I see it in the newspaper, well, what counts for the newspaper these days, the internet, about once a week. And it tends to be a fairly complicated criminal process to deal with. The images that you see here from another cemetery in Carville, Louisiana, which is not far from Baton Rouge. And it was the same thing. It was a church cemetery. They decided that they had some ugly, toppling historic tombs like the one in the top image. And so they took a bulldozer, a backhoe to them and knocked those over. And you see the middle image is what it looks like on the back end. Well, unfortunately, the nice and clean resulted in the debris pile that you see in the bottom image that was put out for garbage pickup. Well, we got a call from a descendant who said, oh my God, they have knocked over my family's tomb. And nobody called me, nobody told me they were doing this, and nobody removed the remains. So we got in touch with the church and we said, okay, guys, what'd y'all do with the remains? And the answer was, oh, they're not in there. Well, where are they, guys? Oh, they're buried underground. This is just decorative above ground. Oh, okay. Not my experience, but we'll see. So I did go to that debris pile, which was a couple of tons of debris, and excavated it, just like an archaeological excavation. When I was done, we did identify 190 fragments of human remains, attributable probably to at least 3 people. The sad component to this is, number one, they're put out for garbage, but number two, the remains that we recovered were the founding members of the church and the donors of the cemetery property. After much private litigation over this case, it ended up not qualifying as criminal desecration, so the district attorney didn't take any action. So the desecration statute was useless in this regard, but after much private litigation over damages and things like that, all that ended up happening was a reburial of the remains in the cemetery under those slabs that you see in the middle image. But all of this said that we had real problems here, and I think you'll find that most states do as well, in the existing law and what can be done to stop this kind of activity. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. All right. So I guess along with those things and going back to the Unmarked Burials Act, which is kind of where I'm going with this, is the Unmarked Burials Act begins, the Historic Cemetery Preservation Act, I think it's called, continues, and then some subsequent laws fill in additional gaps, give us the authority that we need to bridge these gaps in protection of sites. And one of the reasons that this is important is for the reasons that you're seeing here on the screen. And it is this. When these cemetery sites get into disrepair, when they are intentionally or unintentionally knocked down, desecrated, whatever you want to call it, they expose the remains in a lot of cases, and they become prime spots for folks to go pilfer the remains and sell them in the illicit red market. And we have intercepted a bunch of those. Matter of fact, I went and intercepted one last Wednesday that was being sold on eBay out of Lafayette, Louisiana. And we have done some analyses of where this is occurring around the country. And that's at least the article on top that you're seeing there analyzed where this stuff is occurring, and it's all over the place. And so if you think this isn't happening in your state, you're wrong. You know, we have in some cases, as is indicated in the lower article's header, been able to identify some of the remains that we're recovering, and in that case it was a Native American skull, and we were able to get it returned, or into the NAGPRA repatriation process, I should say. So there is some utility that comes to this, but it just shows that these issues and problems of desecration, of dereliction of cemeteries and tombs dovetail into the broader problems of the illicit market in human remains and things like that. Next slide, please. And this is just another illustration of it and the extent to which this goes. This was not a skull that we recovered. This was a story that National Geographic did on the trade, and I'd encourage any of y'all who are interested in this to do a search for that article. It was very well done. Next slide, please. This is a graphic that National Geographic constructed from our research data that showed the prevalence of human remains sales during, I want to say, about a 9-month period on the eBay platform, and so you can see where these skulls are being sold from. And our biggest problem state is California, and a lot of those remains are coming in through the Asian trade from primarily from China. The others are a little bit harder to chase down, and some of them are, as you can see in the bottom scale, are coming from archaeological and forensic contexts. A lot of them are medical specimens, and then there were some that we don't know what they were. Next slide, please. This is an example of some that we have recovered from illicit sales in Louisiana. This was one that was going on Facebook. And they are Native American remains. We're not completely certain, but fairly certain, and are in the process of dealing with NAGPRA repatriation. The story that goes along with it, as you can see in the Facebook post there, is complete. It's complete fabrication. There's nothing on the remains that associates them with any kind of the claims that are being made, such as somebody being hit in the head with an axe or anything like that. But what it does illustrate, and we do not believe that these originated from Louisiana either. These, if memory serves me correctly, seem to be associated with some additional materials that suggest they came from Florida. How they made it here is really anybody's guess, but we have been in communication with the appropriate Florida tribes about their repatriation. But these were clearly buried remains that came out of burial sites, cemetery sites, that need the protections that exist, and not only do they need the protections that exist in many states, but they need enforcement of those protections. And that's to a large degree, not completely, but to a large degree, it's the lack of interest of that enforcement that we see driving a lot of these illicit sales and looting and things like that. Next slide. This is just some summary slides of the stuff that we did recover. You can go on to the next slide. Okay, this one y'all may have seen online. If not, I encourage you to look up Bongazi. It's just an entertaining, if sad, story. And this was an individual who was selling human remains through a private Facebook group for quote-unquote spell work. And she noted that she was acquiring those remains from a cemetery in New Orleans, where you could just go out to the cemetery and collect up bones, and they were there free for the taking. A fairly lengthy criminal investigatory process ensued. and we were able to arrest the person and recover the remains. Unfortunately, the way she collected them, they're commingled, and we'll never know whose grave they came from in what is effectively a potter's field in New Orleans. But it did give us an opportunity to beef up some of Louisiana's protections for these types of sites and against these types of events. Next slide, please. I think it's a continuation. Now, there she is in her mugshot. So she did, she was convicted, and this is another kind of practice tip on this stuff, is that, you know, we're always trying to refine these site protection laws, cemetery protection laws, to prevent this kind of activity, or at least to shore up the protections that exist for cemetery sites. But she was prosecuted and convicted. Actually, she pled about halfway through under just a basic theft statute, a criminal theft statute. We started really combing the laws real hard and found that felony theft in Louisiana also included the unauthorized entry and removal of materials from cemeteries. And the point, I suppose, to this is we didn't use any of these special laws that now, you know, I've been involved in their creation for 15 years, and some of it predates me. We just used straight old-fashioned good old criminal law. And she was given 5 years for that, spent over a month in Orleans Parish Prison awaiting her hearing. And, you know, if that's not a deterrent to folks not to do this kind of stuff, boy, I don't know what is. I have heard that Orleans Parish Prison is a bad, bad place. Anyway, next slide. So she wasn't alone. We did find another guy, and that's a screenshot from his Instagram while he was removing a long bone from an African-American cemetery in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I think this was last year. And he actually put on there, "Is this bad luck?" Well, yeah, it actually ended up being bad luck for him. He was arrested. He didn't actually steal the remains. He just pulled them out of the graves and played with them, you know, did stuff while he was videoing himself, and then posted them on Instagram. He pled to the misdemeanor of desecration, but something that he did in the process, being a misdemeanor, you don't generally see a $10,000 bail set. Somewhere in the process, and we never got the details on this, he must have royally pissed off the judge. And so his bail went from something like $500 to $10,000. So he spent several weeks in jail, and we were able to recover those remains, and we know which graves they came from, and are working with the church to get those back to their specific burial locations. But just another illustration of using old-fashioned criminal law to deal with this stuff. Next slide. So in 2016, we did pass Louisiana Human Remains Trafficking and Control Act. And to a large extent, that law was passed because of the things you see here in this slide. These are all wonderful places in my hometown of New Orleans: the Museum of Death, which admittedly started in LA, the Voodoo Museum, and I can't even see the bottom of that, the Haunted Museum. Anyway, each of these things have actual human remains of dubious origin in their collections. And so this law was enacted in part to deal with the folks like our Bongazi person, but more importantly was to go after these questionable facilities that are holding remains that probably got them from looting archaeological sites or from people who looted archaeological sites. So this law covers almost everything that the cemetery laws don't in terms of the protection of human remains coming from cemeteries, and it definitively states what exists in common and civil law and has existed for centuries, and that is that it's illegal to possess or certainly own human remains outside of educational and research settings. In Louisiana, it makes trafficking in these remains a felony, and that's a significant departure from the prior law here, and it's a significant departure from the law elsewhere in the country. These things are usually misdemeanors. And the idea here was to make these more attractive cases for district attorneys to take on when they've got loaded dockets with murders and other such important crimes. But it does contain amnesty provisions for institutions like these, and we've had discussions with these institutions. We know what's in their collections and are in the process, very slowly, of working our way through them to determine whether some of these need to be shuttled into a NAGPRA process or into some other kind of repatriation process. But if they don't, and if folks are voluntarily giving up the remains for the purposes that they were intended for, either burial or educational research purposes in the case of teaching specimens, then we won't arrest them and we won't prosecute them. So all of that exists within this act. To my knowledge, this is the only law of its kind in the country. But it's a neat little thing, and we've had a chance to use it a couple of times since it was passed. Next slide, please. All right. So again, we come back to just the kind of run-of-the-mill stuff that we see. And this was a sale of human remains in Louisiana. And you'll note, if you look at the top of the eBay image there, that it was around Valentine's. And you know, what better Valentine's gift to give than the gift of a human head? This one clearly was not looted from an archaeological site, and it probably, though not definitively from the imagery, was not a forensic specimen. It was probably a teaching skull. And so this is the run-of-the-mill stuff that we see, but it is illegal to possess or sell this stuff in Louisiana, and frankly under common law elsewhere as well. So this was one of our early recoveries many years ago, and this one is now being used because we did determine it to be an anatomical specimen. It's being used, I believe, by Tulane University as part of their teaching collections. Next slide. So where are they coming from? Well, this is a pretty good example of your broken down, run down tombs. That is, I think this one has been repaired. That's an Oddfellows Cemetery at the foot of Canal Street in New Orleans. And it's a close up and a wider angle view. That's what the tomb looks like. And then as you get up close to the tomb, you can see all of the human remains that are scattered around. And among those remains, you can see that all the best bits are missing. The skull is missing, and we've got a couple of bone fragments, but nothing of any real economic, albeit illicit economic value, or really curio value, because it's just fragments. So the best bits have been taken already, and we don't know where they are. But it's just an example of some of the interrelation of the cemetery protection laws and the human remains protections and problems. Next slide. Again, just some more of the eBay seizures. This was another obviously prepared teaching skull. This one now is, or I think it's tomb. These are now part of Tulane's anthropological teaching collections. Next slide. Again, just some of the range. So this was a single seizure. The skull on the left is a obviously prepared anatomical teaching specimen, but the skull on the right appears to have been buried and disinterred. We don't know the circumstances of it. You can see there's something in the orbits of that thing. Somebody wired this thing for light. It is a real skull, and those are red lights in the orbits. And it has an AC plug, and you plug it in, and those orbits will light up. It is, well, about as disrespectful as you can get. And we really are fairly baffled with this one as to any kind of affiliation and what to do with it. We don't have a definitive descendant community. So this one's one that we're still scratching our heads over about how to properly dispose of it. Next slide, please. And then, we get random stuff as well. One of them on the right, the Lake Bourne skull, this one actually came up in a fisherman's net. And you can see the barnacles on it. This one we're including in our probable Native American samples and are working with tribes for reinterment. The one that's labeled Hattiesburg skull, we actually had a contact from somebody in Mississippi that said My daughter purchased this skull from an online site, and it said it was from the New Orleans area. So I thought I should maybe get it back to where it came from. So that's another one that's in process for being determined whether it's Native American, and if not, if we can narrow down to figure out where it should go to. But again, a looted skull, not an anatomical specimen. Next slide. These are also some other bizarre things that we're seeing. Not bizarre so much as just they're difficult to deal with, and that is the kapalas. Tibetan kapalas are a very active thing being sold on eBay all over the world. Matter of fact, we track this stuff, and in the last year and a half, I believe, we've tracked over 1,000 such sales. These are human remains, no question. They are real, and the question is, what law applies here? Is this a prohibited sale of human remains? In Louisiana, we know that it is. We don't know in other jurisdictions if their transformation into a ritual item transforms them from being straight human remains that are prohibited from ownership into something else. Though we have been working with some folks who specialize in this, who have informed us that all of the ones that we have and have seen are items made for the tourist trade. And the bulk of those, you can tell, were looted from graves and worked on, modern, carpentry equipment to make different designs. So people are looting graves for the purpose of creating these kapala, skull cups, if you will, for sale to tourists. Next slide. There's one of our other examples. This one is one where you can actually see the electric saw skip marks on the side. You can't see it in these images. But again, it was also easier to authenticate as a real human skull because you could make out all the details in the endocranium and the cross section there. Next slide. All right, so I know we're running into kind of the end of time here. So some of the other cemetery-related problems that we have, and a matter of fact, I got a new one of these this morning. The sale of cemetery dirt on especially eBay. This stuff is also being used as quote-unquote, active activity in, for voodoo sales or whatever. Legitimacy of it is always questionable. But you can see some of this stuff is done really nicely. But the concern and the question is, if folks are going into cemeteries and digging up dirt, what else are they pulling up with them? Is that act of digging in the cemeteries without authorization some kind of criminal desecration, or is it a violation of the historic preservation laws that exist for cemetery site protections? In Louisiana, we've taken the position that it is, and we regularly seize these things from sales within the state. But again, the order of magnitude that this is going on nationwide is fairly staggering. We've been collecting data, but I can't give you any numbers. We haven't analyzed it yet. But it's in the order of hundreds of auctions per year. And in some of the samples that we have recovered and analyzed, we have found bone material in the dirt. So it's legitimately coming from, at least some of them are legitimately coming from actual cemeteries, and this is damage to those sites. So we are actively discouraging this through the existing and more recent protection laws in Louisiana. Next slide. This one's just one of my favorites. I just gotta show you all this one because along with the dirt sales, we're also seeing coffin nails. 90% of the time, those are definitively not coffin nails. They are, somebody went to Home Depot, bought some nails, put them out in the rain until they rusted, and are now selling them as coffin nails for use in voodoo activity. Not criminal in the way that we would think of, but probably fraud. We also have, and you can see here, in the image on the left, that is not Marie Laveau's tomb, but it is often mistaken for Marie Laveau's tomb in St. Louis 1 in New Orleans. And this person had acquired that stone at the bottom from next to the grave and was selling it on eBay as a Marie Laveau curio. We don't want to encourage this type of activity. We think that now this is probably prohibited under existing laws, but this was probably more than a decade ago, so we really didn't have any way to stop this kind of activity. But my absolute favorite, and mercifully eBay has put a stop to this, is the bottom right. In this auction, somebody was actually selling a haunting. They guaranteed if you paid them $20 that upon their death, they would come and haunt you. And so this is kind of the bizarre stuff that we see in this area of the law, or enforcing this area of law in Louisiana. And we've seen them elsewhere, but this one was from Louisiana. eBay has now put a stop to selling hauntings on eBay. Anyway, next slide, please. And this is just kind of illustrative of some of the problems that we deal with in regulating the abandoned cemeteries or the hidden cemeteries. You can see in that USGS quad map in the top corner that there's no indication, and USGS is really good about documenting cemeteries, but they miss them, and there's no real indication in this imagery that a cemetery is there, but it is, and it's right off of I-10 outside of Baton Rouge, and all you can see from the closest road is that stand of trees in the bottom left image. When you get up into them, you see they're above ground tombs, and you can clearly see that these things have been broken into. And they've been broken into right over the heads of them. And the skeletal remains are missing. So they're just, you know, these kind of abandoned cemeteries. And again, this is just another reason why we've enacted some of the laws. Is once we get leads on this stuff, and we actually did ultimately recover a skull from this site, you know, we're able to trace this stuff down and legally go after the folks that are doing this damage. Next slide. These are just some cautionary concepts. This is this notion, and we've come across this lately in a lot of road expansions in Louisiana. That's just something to be aware of and watch for your dedication, cemetery dedication laws in various states, in areas where you know that there are actual cemeteries, but you don't know the extent of the burials. And this is one historic cemetery here in Baton Rouge that you can see. It's very nice, kind of New England-y looking thing in the bottom left image. And you can see plenty of tombstones, but what you can see in the upper left image is a map that was constructed using probe data from the site. And each one of the little ovals there is a probable unmarked grave. And that's been confirmed in some cases by archaeological excavation that we've undertaken at this site. And you can see in the bottom right image a sunken marker that was uncovered out there. The point of this is that what you see isn't always what you get. And we've got a lot of road projects going through in Louisiana that think that they can get real close to a cemetery, but they're okay because they're not in it. And this is really just kind of a cautionary slide to say, you know, watch out for what you're doing because you may accidentally hit something you didn't want to. Next slide. So this really kind of brings it back around to basic notions under the law that everybody should be aware of, no matter what state you're in. Roughly, if there are human remains in the ground, more likely than not, you've got a cemetery under the law. Next slide. And that's why I encourage everybody to go check their cemetery laws and look for the concept known as the cemetery dedication. This concept, as this slide suggests, since about the 6th century in ancient Rome. And so it can be traced to modern legal concepts in both the civil law and the common law traditions. And that's where we get this idea that once you've got a body in the ground, this property becomes inviolate under the law. And it is protected until you go through a legal process to remove those remains. Next slide. And I put this image here as kind of a famous example. That's the Superdome, for those of y'all who don't know. But the image below is the Girard Street Cemetery, which is, well, it's no longer, but it was partially located under the streets and the parking area for the cemetery, for the Superdome. And, you know, for many years, it was an old legend that said the Saints will never win the Super Bowl because their stadium was built on top of a cemetery. They are cursed. And that is true. That's exactly what happened. The cemetery was removed pursuant to law, but the remains were not all removed. And every project that goes in the vicinity of the Superdome, and this is just an indication of the timing of this. This was done in the 1950s, and so we believe that it was just public works employees and maybe some funeral directors removing what they expected to find, casketed remains. And so when we get into the situation of isolated stuff that folks like archaeologists are going to be specialized to identify. Those things were slipping through the cracks and getting away from people at the time. And now every time a project goes in around here, we find more of that stuff out at this site. Next slide. That's a repeat, or maybe you went backwards. Try again. Skip that one. I know we're running out of time. This is just to make y'all aware, the African American Burial Grounds Network Act, House Resolution 1179 is pending in Congress right now to create a NAGPRA style protection for African American cemeteries around the country. Next slide. It's an important act, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it. Louisiana has passed an analogous provision. It's got a terribly cumbersome name, the Slavery Ancestral Burial Grounds Preservation Commission, which is intended to create a law like the African Burial Grounds law. It actually predated the federal effort. Just again, make you all aware that it's going. Next slide, please. We'll go ahead and skip this because I know we're out of time. Yeah, these are some of the artifacts that are coming up in our materials. Go ahead and keep going. Or in some skull sales. All right, so last stuff real quickly, disaster response. That's the other component of what we do, and we're up to our eyeballs in it now. So Kate, you can really just slide through these while I'm talking. And everybody's welcome to these slides if y'all want them, and if y'all want to chat about any of this stuff, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end. But what this is to say is that it appears that for cultural preservation purposes, especially when we're talking about cemeteries and those things as really historic, prehistoric ones aren't so much of a problem, but historic resources in the wake of disasters, these things are just getting decimated. And that's what these slides are showing. Here in Louisiana, we have done a good bit of work to create a process for dealing with the fallout because the feds have backed away in large part from managing cemetery disasters after emergencies and things like that. And so this really is a protection of these historic resources, and that's what our goal is. We have established now a task force that gets activated every time there is a cemetery that is disrupted as a result of a disaster, and we go in as a team of archaeologists, funeral directors, and first responders to work through the management of bringing these historic resources back to the closest we can get them to what they used to be. And of course, the slides that are up here are from a massive response effort that we led in 2016 to impacts to 74 cemeteries from flooding. We have only begun to deal with the impacts from flooding for Hurricane Laura, and we're now up to 2 times the size of the impacts that we experienced in 2016, and we haven't even finished assessing them yet. We're up to over 1,800 disturbed or damaged graves in Southwest Louisiana. We're up to 125 damaged cemeteries. Our response team has dropped to a total of 3 people to cover this entire event. You can keep going on the slides, Kate. And these are just kind of imagery of what you're seeing. These are historic cemeteries that are just completely decimated. And you can keep going. We are able to get a hold of these things, and we are able to bring them back to some, semblance of their historic appearance and setting. But it is a massive undertaking, as you can see here, of returning these people, doing the identification work, and returning them to their final resting places. But again, that's a unique law that we have enacted here that I would encourage other states to take a look at because it does take into account the historic preservation concerns of these sites as well as their significance as sites of mourning and grief that have continuing relevance and significance to descendant communities in the area. With that, I will shut up. It looks like, Kate, we are about 3 minutes till the end, so I'll let you do what you want to do now.
If I can figure out how to stop sharing the screen. Let's see. New share. No, I'm gonna leave that and just go. So I think what we do now is look at the Q&A. If I can figure that out. This is really beyond my abilities. Q&A, there we go. Okay, so we have no questions. Ryan, if you could talk a little bit about the impacts Louisiana is seeing with coastal erosion and if that is impacting human burials.
Yeah, sure. And I do know that there in the chat there is one question at least, and I'll just read that one. They kind of dovetail. Has there been any correlation of damage and disturbance from natural disasters and increased looting and or selling of human remains after these disasters? It's a fair question. It's not something that we've analyzed statistically. The best that we've got is anecdotal evidence of things being more accessible, and that we have in places been out to sites, seen remains, and then gone back out to deal with them and not seen them. And it's usually not a recovery thing, it's a theft thing. So what we're doing actively, and the law permits us to do now, is if we come across exposed remains during a disaster response effort, we're authorized to secure those immediately. As a matter of fact, we brought 9 individuals back to our secure lockup at the Department of Justice just last Friday that had been dislodged from their burial locations in Southwest Louisiana so that they can be analyzed and returned. And so it is a real concern, but I can't tell you we have any statistical documentation correlating the two. But yeah, with regard to, Kate, I'm sorry, the question I think was, are we seeing any correlation between climate change and these kinds of impacts? Is that what it was?
Yes.
Roughly, I'd have to say that we are. And if you remember from one of the earlier slides that I showed when I was introducing the Unmarked Burials Act, there was an image of a cemetery that was disappearing underwater. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of these coastal communities. As a matter of fact, some colleagues of mine have done a really nice book on Louisiana's disappearing cemeteries, and they're tying that substantially. I think it's something like Fragile Grounds, I think is the name of it. They're tying that substantially to sea level rise. And we're seeing that definitively in terms of the fact that these, especially coastal sites, be they Native American burial mounds or historic cemeteries in this area, are disappearing underwater and are becoming more exposed to the natural disaster risks that we associate with hurricanes and things like that. So yeah, I think that there is a correlation that we're seeing. Certainly a correlation between what we know of as the rising sea levels and the disappearance of sites and their subsequent damage, erosion, and disappearance. With the increase in storms, we're a much more active group as the state cemetery response task force in chasing down these sites and dealing with their preservation.
So I have one more question. I know that you are from Louisiana and not Georgia, but if you are aware, how was it possible that the Savannah airport was able to pave over graves for their runway? I know that the family did not want them moved, so how was that possible to just pave over?
Off the top of my head, I remember when that happened. I remember the reports of it, and my recollection is that I thought, I really need to see how they did that, and I never did follow through with it. So I don't know the answer. I know that for some areas out there, there were removals done, but I don't know if it covered the whole area. And I can tell you, that what we have out here now is, well, let me back up to your scenario, I suppose, and just to say that, one of the caveats to these protection laws, be they NAGPRA, be they the state level analogs, is that those laws don't mandate the removal of remains if simply sealing them in place is a more archaeologically sound approach. Now, If you dovetail those protections in with existing cemetery dedication laws, you should have to remove them. Now, in the scenario that you talk about, it's not just that whether they removed or didn't remove, but it's also that they may or may not have had descendant community consent. And that gets into a sticky area of these laws, and one that we're finding is increasingly problematic, and that is the lack of agency that we see for the descendant communities in these scenarios. That the laws require consultation, but they don't put the descendant communities in the driver's seat in terms of what happens to these sites. And you know, that is something that that's where you really get into the conflict of private property rights with regard to the owners of the property and the descendant interests. And that's something that none of the existing laws have worked out and proposed changes to. So I can't even say that we've had tests of the convergence of those two issues. But I think it's more that than anything else. So it could very well be that they went through a permitting process and decided, you know what, these things are better left here intact. And, you know, we hear what the community is saying, but we're not obligated as the regulators to do anything about it. And it's an unfortunate scenario, but it is one that is, in, you know, it exists in virtually, off the top of my head, every regulatory scheme that I'm aware of for these types of sites.
And then I have one more question. Are you finding that there are certain communities that are more at risk of desecration of burial sites or of their cemeteries being at risk of flooding, particularly the unmarked burials, the ones that are associated with plantations and so on?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to say really across the board. Matter of fact, my dissertation that I'm in the last stages of working on right now looks in part at that question. And, you know, anecdotally, there is ample evidence that we have got, you know, damage, desecration, destruction due to natural events, due to anthropogenic events of cemeteries across all ethnic and ancestral backgrounds as a reality. I think that the bulk of the available evidence bears out that absolutely minority communities are on the unfortunate receiving end of probably more adverse cemetery impacts, I guess is the best way of putting it, disruptions to their sites. And that stuff is really more anthropogenic than it is natural. The natural impacts, it's really just a factor of where you live. At least in Louisiana, the folks that live in the coastal communities are going to be more impacted. And that really does not seem to fall along any kind of ethnic lines or anything like that. But, you know, if you look at the reported jurisprudence in Louisiana, we've got a fairly even application of go on and dig up the dead folk judgments that are coming out or have come out historically in the middle 20th century. Again, as part of my dissertation research, I've analyzed impacts to a Jewish cemetery in New Orleans, a predominantly Caucasian Protestant cemetery in New Orleans. That's the one that went under the Superdome. And then mixed, you know, African-American, Caucasian potters fields that were disrupted by road construction in the New Orleans area. And so, you know, at least in those that we have reported jurisprudence on and we have documented archaeological evidence for, it seems to be happening across the board as just these are spaces that in the path of development are afterthoughts or non-thoughts. And it's not necessarily a targeting, though I think you can say that, you know, if you're a disenfranchised group, your sites are going to be less well protected than if you're not.
All right. Thank you. I think if anybody has any extra questions, either email them to me or Ryan. And I think I would like to thank Brian for taking the time and speaking with us. Also, thank you to everyone who joined the webinar. Really appreciate y'all taking the time to learn about the protection of humans, human remains. So thank you all very much. I hope everyone has a great day. And if you missed any of it, I recorded the entire webinar and it will be up later on. So thank you.
Cool. Thanks for having me.